Welcome on, YouTubers. Thanks so much for joining us. Please give us a like and subscribe because clearly all of you wanted to watch an award show live right now. So let us do our ceremonial making the faces, Danny. Your feeling on the Rookie of the Year race as it stands right now.
Let's see. The difficulty of the decision at the top of the MVP ballot.
And the race for second place in not executive of the year. Okay. Let's do a podcast here. This is going to be fun. All right. Happy Oscar Sunday, everyone. But we have our own awards that we have to get to here on Dunc'd On and Dunc'd On Prime. I want to remind everyone who is not subscribed to our free newsletter, which comes generally twice a week with Dan Feldman's Daily Dunks. Please give that a subscribe. Link to that is in the show notes. It costs you absolutely nothing, and you can just get some writing. So a great way to hopefully indoctrinate you into the Dunc'd On universe a little bit, and then we can upsell you on the actual subscription. Yeah, but would you like some dessert with that? So let's begin here, Danny. You're kind enough to rejoin us from paternity leave because I know you like to weigh in on these awards. The MVP race.
So I think the place to start here is that the top two is pretty clearly two individuals in whatever order, Nikola Jokic and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And sometimes I ask you to start this, but I'll just say my opinion is that I now have these players in the same tier. That is a step forward for Shai from where he was. And I'll explain the biggest reason why. And it's because Shai Gilgeous-Alexander has always had a huge role within the Thunder offense. 49% total usage, which is a stat that we're using a fair amount now. So that combines.
Oh no, we call it creation now.
Okay,
49%
total creation.
Total creation. Don't worry. We're gonna get there. We got it. We're doing some rebranding, but it'll sink in.
So Shai has always had a large role within the Thunder offense, and he's having, of course, a fabulous year. Just so we can put some of that out there, 64% true shooting, that 49% total creation. For those who like the traditional usage rate, that's 34%. And he's been a wonderful defensive player. He's not the most important defensive player, but he's been a part of that. So Shai's case is pretty unassailable to be in this. But the only real weakness for him, for me, on the previous awards, when I haven't had him in the same tier with Jokic, was that the Thunder offense, while it was good, it wasn't really good during his minutes. And that is something that I have really grown to appreciate. It will come up at other points is like, can you generate not only offense, but high level offense? And so the Thunder now 121.6 offensive rating when Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is on the floor. That isn't the 126 that it is for the Nuggets with Jokic, but it's in the same ballpark. And to me, that was the last thing that Shai's case needed. So I have them in the same tier. Let's start there.
That number again, that Shai on-court offensive rating, 121.6. That's what you have there?
Yes.
Yeah. And now that is still 4.7 points 100 lower than when Nikola Jokic is on the floor for the Denver Nuggets. But I would say very clearly to me, Jokic is still the better offensive player. I would say that he has about the same because Jamal Murray has come on some as well. I think that's helped them. That 126 number is just a crazy number. I'll try to put that in a little more context going forward here. But Jamal Murray is a pretty good number two. I don't know that he's much better of a number two offensively than Jalen Williams is. Nuggets don't have a ton of shooting. They've got some guys who can attack inside, but Jokic, to me, he just creates by far the most high value shots in basketball. He's not quite as high of a scoring creation as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, but he is overall slightly higher creation because you consider that he is one of the highest passing creations. About 20% of Nuggets possessions are him throwing a pass that leads to a shot or free throws. And then you throw in that the Nuggets as a team have the most points created by assists. Cavs are number 2 in that metric. And Nikola Jokic is just the man who dimes guys up right at the rim. I talked about this in my chat. I was asked who I thought the best passer was in the NBA, and are all assists created equal? And absolutely they are not. And Nikola Jokic has the best assist quality in the NBA, and you can see it with things like the number of points that the Denver Nuggets get on cuts, the number of points that the Denver Nuggets get at the rim. The way I characterized Nikola Jokic's passing versus just about everyone else's, and part of this is because of the position he plays at center. He's such a devastating scorer inside. These are shorter range passes that he's throwing, and he's doing it without having to wildly drive to the basket. But all of this offensive game goes together. I think that other guys, the other great passers, they find the open man. Nikola Jokic, he finds the covered man for a layup. That's the difference to me, and why the Denver Nuggets just get such unbelievable shots despite being such a limited shooting team. They've added Russell Westbrook, haven't missed a beat there. And I believe that 126.3 offensive rating when Jokic is on the floor is the highest of anyone that I've ever seen. And he is the highest in that metric of anyone that we are looking at here, other than Darius Garland, who's a 125.3. Everyone else in this analysis is 122 or below. And again, it's not like the Denver Nuggets have so much amazing talent around him.
I agree with all of that. I think that Jokic is the best offensive player in the league. I don't think it's particularly close. But I mean, it's so fascinating with Jokic because his being a center makes his offense so much more devastating. And it is not in any way like the Nuggets defense is truly like abysmal when he's on the floor, though 114.2 is pretty bad. But the argument in favor of Shai, which is fascinating when we're talking about a perimeter player, is that he not only gives the other guys the latitude to do what they do. That's the old Russell Westbrook argument. And Shai Gilgeous-Alexander doesn't have the same role there, but he is an active positive within that defense. Even if he isn't the anchor, he does so many things well that are important to what the Thunder do.
Yeah, I want to get to the defense in a second because that's going to be a huge tiebreaker. I just wanted to sing Jokic's praises and Shai's a little bit more on the offense. But Jokic, not only is he easily the best passer in the game, but he also has the highest true shooting percentage of any player who, with any kind of a high usage, who's in consideration for any of the All-NBA awards. Domantas Sabonis is 66.2, Jokic is 66.3. Then Shai himself at 64.2. That is fourth highest of anyone we're considering. Evan Mobley is 64.4, but obviously doesn't have anywhere near the same offensive load of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. So I think in contrast to last year, when I probably would have given the nod to Luka Doncic as the second best offensive player in last year's regular season, I think Shai is clearly the second best offensive player now in basketball. But Jokic still is far above him. So as you're starting to allude to here, maybe you can elaborate on this. What is the, unless you had anything more on the offense?
No, I think you summarized it well.
Yeah. So does the difference between Shai's defense and Jokic's defense make up for what we both agree is a gap on offense?
To me, it does, to put them in the same tier, but not to put Shai above Jokic. And it's close. Like, to me, that's what tiers are. I think that you can make a credible argument for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander to win the MVP over Nikola Jokic. And the reason why, even though I'm not doing it, is because of that supplemental role. So Shai is a very productive steals player in his own right. 2 per 36 is strong. Jokic is actually pretty good in that respect as well. Shai actually blocks more shots than Jokic does per 36, and I think overall. And that rim protection actually is a part of the story. And of course, it's more of a supplemental rim protection thing. But, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander contests about 17% of shots when he's on the floor, and he's a guard. But he's at times he's the low man. He helps force turnovers in that respect. And he actually, incredibly enough, according to the rim protection stats that we have, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander actually, opponents shoot a lower percentage on the shots he contests than Nuggets opponents do when Jokic is there, if I'm reading the stats correctly, which I believe that I am.
Yeah, Jokic allows 70% shooting around the rim, contesting 29.6% of opponent shots at the rim. Shai allows 65% shooting, contesting 16.5%, which is that's a solid number for a guard. It's been lower for him in the past, but then also he makes a lot of plays in the passing lanes on steals, other help plays. So Shai is clearly the better defender, even though he's not asked to guard on ball that much. He also is not exactly getting attacked on ball. Whereas Jokic, I think, is having a pretty bad defensive season by his standards. And he's also, this is his age 30 season now. It's just the offense has been really good, but yeah, their defense has slipped. They're 20th now. Not a great defense when he's on the floor. And Shai is part of one of the best defenses of all time and a very positive part of that.
And that's a part of why, some of the overall stats are really jaw-dropping for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. That 121.6 offensive rating is fabulous, but the plus 17.3 Thunder net rating when Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is on the floor, that is awesome. That is the best of anyone we're considering for All-NBA. That is, even with the offensive gap, that is still over 5 points per 100 possessions better than the Nuggets with Jokic. And it is true that the Thunder are better with Shai off than the Nuggets are with Jokic off. I don't care nearly as much about that because that just is, in some ways, it's a reflection of the teammates and the scheme and all that type of stuff. And it's also worth noting, I mentioned that I have Jokic over Gilgeous-Alexander, that if you have, depending on how much you value things like EPM says that Gilgeous-Alexander has been the superior player both per minute and because Shai has played more minutes as the overall player. So there are arguments, and I haven't gone through all of the other stats there, that go one direction or the other. I think BPM has Jokic ahead, but it is, to me, it is a very close race.
Yeah, DPM is another EPM like metric created by Kostya Medvedeski, who that we have in our mix this year. And yeah, Shai has played 57 games. Jokic has played 52, although the bulk of those were missed due to the birth of his child. I feel like I can give him a pass there in terms of that difference. Jokic actually plays more minutes per game. Part of that is because the Thunder blow people out a lot more than the Nuggets. But yeah, these two guys are just completely in another league. You mentioned Jokic, 20.6 points per 100 better the Nuggets are when he's on the floor than off. Shai is actually number 2 in the league in that metric, at least among high minute players that we're considering for All NBA, 16.4. And then there's nobody else other than, ironically, Trae Young, who's barely into the double digits. Everyone else is below double digits in that net rating differential. I'm going to go with Jokic, though I do a tiebreaker to the guy I consider to be the superior player. I still do consider to be that Jokic to be that. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander could certainly seize that crown, I think, in these playoffs. And Jokic, obviously, he wasn't able to come through at the very end in last year's playoffs. He ran out of gas a little bit against Minnesota, though he certainly was very awesome at times in that series. So, I think ultimately, I think that Jokic is the superior player. He's just generally harder to stop, and I don't think that his defense is so damaging that that makes up for the gap between their offense still.
And,
but it is very close. It is one of the closer situations I can recall.
I'm extremely excited to see how the rest of the season goes. And while both these players can have different emphasis beyond this, with the Thunder being really close to clinching the West and everything else, and how that's going to impact all this stuff is potentially worth considering. But also on the Jokic defensive front, this has come up with different players of the years, but his offensive brilliance allows them to play better defenders. And I do think that is a part of the value that he provides. Now, it is also fair to note that Shea, has their offense has played with more traditional centers than maybe we thought this year due to the extended absence for Chet Holmgren and everything else, but they've done a really good job. So these are two, and not only are these two equally matched MVP candidates, I'm not going to go all into the Bill Simmons MVP thing, but I think thinking about it just briefly, these are strong MVP cases relative to other MVPs. Like this isn't Curry's unanimous MVP year, that type of thing, but these guys are doing amazing work.
Yeah, I mean, especially like when you consider the overall team performance, the Nuggets being plus 12 when he's on the floor, Shea being plus 17 again. Like that plus 17 is a number that really has last been seen for an individual player back with the Warriors in the later part of the last decade. Like that is just an insane number. And obviously the Thunder are statistically one of the best teams of all time. Let's fill out the rest of our MVP ballot.
While the top of the ballot is incredibly strong, I think that there is a lot of weakness in the rest of the MVP ballot, and this will flow into all NBA as well. To me, the next two players are Giannis Antetokounmpo and Jason Tatum. And I think that Giannis has been the better per minute player than Tatum. He has this really massive role within the Bucks, over 50% total creation. He's the only guy that I had in high level all NBA consideration who is over 50%. LaMelo is over 2. And the Bucks offense has been very strong, 117-2 when he's been on the floor. And Giannis's defense has waxed and waned over the course of the year. Of course, it was memorably very impactful in the NBA Cup, but it hasn't been that way necessarily every possession, especially before that. But I give Jason Tatum the nod for number 3, in part because of the more significant difference in minutes played. Those guys are about 500 minutes apart. That isn't just like a little quirk. That's many games worth of time. And so for Tatum, I mean, it is so funny that you I think said the line years ago that he's destined to be like 4th or 5th in MVP every year. 59% true shooting, but he's taken on a larger playmaking role. The 14% playmaking creation is actually really close to Giannis. And the Celtics have been, very good, like basically a plus 10 when he's been on the floor. And notably, because remember, there were all these years that they fell off a cliff when Tatum was off the floor, at least relatively speaking. They're actually pretty close to even this year. But I still think that Jason Tatum has played well enough to deserve an MVP ballot. I think he's 3rd in part because the rest of the players in this range in terms of talent have either been unavailable or not having their best year.
Well, I would even say that Tatum's case to me has actually slackened a bit, but just that everyone else has fallen off, perhaps even more, with the exception of one gentleman who we'll talk about here in a moment. Tatum had been more efficient, had been shooting the 3 better earlier. He's down to right about league average again, although he's certainly getting them up with 10 per 36.
Mm-hmm.
And 6.3 of those 10 per 36 are self-created. So those are difficult shots. And also you mentioned he's having his best passing creation season with 13.8 passing creation passes, leading 13.8% of possessions. Tatum throws a pass leading to a shot or free throws. And then the Celtics really were struggling with him off the floor early. That's now increased a bit. And then his own on number has gone down to 9.6. The Celtics just generally haven't been as dominant this season. Another thing too for Tatum is he is, I believe, number 1 in the NBA. I didn't write this down. I looked at it though in the research. Number 1 in the NBA among players who've played more than 1,500 minutes in terms of opponent 3-point differential.
Ooh.
So opponents are actually making 6.8% fewer of their 3-pointers with Tatum on the floor than when he's off, which could be at least a little due to him, but not entirely. So some of his defensive numbers in terms of the net rating, there's a little bit of funny money there. We'll get into another guy who's really been on the opposite end of being hurt by some of the his own teams and the opponent's 3-point numbers in a second, or maybe we won't in your case. I don't know. We'll see. So yeah, I got Tatum 3. Giannis, he's right on the cusp here, though, of not qualifying. And
That's true.
Victor Wembanyama, I decided not to include him here because we know he's not going to play again. He technically has played, I believe, in the actually, I'm not sure, but I think he's like right on the edge of having played the percentage of games, but he hasn't technically missed enough games that he can't qualify. Everyone else, my policy is if you haven't missed so many games that you are officially eliminated as of now, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you could play in all the remaining games and still qualify for the awards. But Victor, we know that he will not do that.
Well, I'll mention briefly on Victor. My policy is that I think of these as a snapshot. And so for me, Wembanyama played in 46 games. That wasn't quite enough for me to put him over some of the other MVP candidates, but he will factor into my other awards, and we'll get there when we get there.
Yeah. Well, Giannis has only played 45 games. So, and also Tatum has played almost 500 more minutes and 11 more games than Giannis. So clearly he needs to be above him. I would even say maybe Tatum should be in a tier above Giannis. How many games have the Bucks played? So the Milwaukee Bucks have played 59 games, and Giannis has played in 45 of them. So he I don't know where he falls in like the 20-minute zone or something like that, but he can only miss 3 more games before he would be ineligible for awards. But my number 5 guy is Evan Mobley of the Cleveland Cavaliers.
I have no problem with that. I have a tentative 5th, but I'm not all the way there. And Mobley's case is fascinating. I'll let you, since you have him 5th, I may end up putting him 5th. I'll let you start making the case.
Yeah, it's just that the Cleveland Cavaliers, who became, I think, one of 12 teams to win 50 of their first 60 games or better today. 122.6 offensive rating when he's on the floor.
Sorry, it's a 121.9 when he's on the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, this is not in our usual format. 121.9 when he's on the floor, which is actually, they get slightly worse when he goes or is on the floor. Part of that is because he usually is staggered from Darius Garland, and Garland has been unbelievable, as I'm sure we'll get to, as an offensive player, and the Cavs' offensive performance when he's been on the floor. But still, 121.9, that is better than the Oklahoma City Thunder with Shea on the floor. Surely the Cavs have more offensive talent, but that still is noteworthy. He's been a very positive offensive player. I mentioned his true shooting has gotten so much better at 64.4%. He also has been a much larger part of the offense, but then defensively is where he really makes his hay. 106.6 defensive rating when Evan Mobley is on the floor. That is the best of any of these candidates for All NBA by a fairly significant margin. Outside of Jaren Jackson Jr. is the only guy within a point of him. And then plus 15.3 net rating when Evan Mobley is on the floor. That is second best in this sample of All NBA players, behind Shea at 17.3. He's even better than Jokic, even better than Donovan Mitchell, even though Mitchell is largely tethered to him in terms of their minutes. Mitchell is third in that metric at 13.3. And Mobley, we've talked about it again. They've shored things up a little bit now with the trade they made for Hunter, but some of the defensive units that he was anchoring were absolutely ridiculous in terms of just not a lot of talent around him. And he was just the reason why those units were passable. And then, of course, they were killing on the offensive end. And I think he has become a much better passer. He can finish around the rim. He can beat smaller players. I think he's their best player, or at least has been their best player this year. certainly to me is their most irreplaceable player, and the numbers reflect that. They are 9.3 points 100 better when he is on the floor versus off. And
Mobley,
they also are just a monster when he's on the floor too. So you see every component of his statistical resume in terms of the on-off stuff is unassailable.
And Mobley's an incredibly efficient individual player, 64% true shooting, and does that on 31% total creation, which is still on the low side relative to the other guys we're talking about. But like it's not like Ivica Zubac or one of those like really, really defense only players who Zubac will be mentioned in other categories, but not for MVP. And for Mobley, like it is true that like he has played significantly fewer minutes than let's say somebody like Jalen Brunson. But I think of some of these other guys that I had loosely in consideration, the arguments against them were more persuasive than the arguments for. So like Jalen Brunson, he's played over 2,000 minutes. He has a large role within the Knicks offense, 45.6, but the Knicks offense isn't as superlative as it once was. They're at a 119.2 offensive rating, and that's very good, but it's not in the like preposterous range, like let's say what Halliburton was doing to get in the MVP conversation early last year. And maybe that's too high a bar. But so you have that for Brunson, and then for Steph Curry, who has a smaller like total creation role in part because of what Steve Kerr wants to do. The Warriors 117 overall offensive rating when Stephen Curry's on the floor, and he's had some incandescent games, including that Orlando win where he had 56 and 12 threes. But there have been some duds in there, and those duds have cost the Warriors some games. And so I think that Mobley's a good pick for fifth. I think I will pick him. He was in my kind of group as well, in part because the offense first guys, which I'm generally in the belief that offense is more important than defense in the regular season, generating those shots. But I don't think those guys have really strong enough resumes.
Yeah, and Mobley hasn't played that many minutes, but part of that again is because the Cavs have just really blown people out. He's playing, and he certainly has been plenty healthy. Also, I think the one real rough stretch that they had this season, it came when he was unavailable for just a couple of games.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was like either a calf or an ankle. I can't remember exactly.
I think it was a calf, but I'm not 100%.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I thought Mobley was a clear number 5, but I'll go with my next tranche here. And certainly Brunson was in that category for me. Jaren Jackson Jr. in that category for me as well. I just thought he's probably been a little bit better than Mobley on offense just because he creates more, a little bit larger portion of the Memphis offense, even though if that's almost entirely still as a scorer. And I just think Mobley is a little bit better of a defensive player. Jackson has probably had to carry Memphis slightly more, though neither of them really they play about the same number of minutes. Jackson's played a couple more games, but this is one where I think kind of they have pretty similar cases. Both guys who are very good two-way players. Jackson can shoot it a little bit better, gets guarded out a little bit more, but also I think one of the biggest differences is that Mobley is someone that I really trust to play center. Jackson, I don't necessarily. And I also actually like Mobley a little bit better guarding one-on-one on the perimeter. And I think Mobley is a little bit more solid positionally. Like I just trust Mobley to be the only big. Jackson largely Memphis just hasn't been comfortable with him in that role. So ultimately, I think I like Mobley a little bit better there, but Jackson's certainly a very solid second team All-NBA. You mentioned Brunson. Brunson also has been one of the league's best clutch players. Mm-hmm. He's having a nice run of that lately. So that can factor into. And then Curry, with this recent run that he's been on, he's gotten back into this second team All-NBA category. And I think I would have to put Darius Garland in that group too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You want to make the case for him?
I will. So Darius Garland has not only a pretty large role within the Cavs offense, 42% total creation, but also the Cavs offense has been incredible when Darius Garland has been on the floor. And even though it is a team effort, they have been they've been worse when he's been off. And when you consider the player who's largely replacing him in the split lineups is Donovan Mitchell, who is on my All-NBA teams as well, that's pretty high praise. But a 125.3 Cavs offensive rating when Darius Garland's on the floor, that's only a point per 100 possessions below what the Nuggets are doing with Nikola Jokic. And that's materially better than his teammates. That's better than Mobley's at 121.9. That's better than Mitchell. That's better than Jared Allen. So at least some of that is Garland. And a part of the reason why that's the case for Darius Garland is that he's been a very successful passer this year, but also he has been very efficient in his own offense. 62.6% true shooting, in part because he is taking and making a crap ton of threes, 8.3 per 36, making, 42.5% of those. That is ridiculous. Like, that is the percentage like Jokic and Sabonis are making, but on significantly fewer attempts. And a lot of Garland's are self-created. About half of his threes are self-created. So I felt like maybe I should have Garland more in the MVP. It's like, well, why am I putting Jalen Brunson there and not Darius Garland? When you think about, that the Cavs offense is so much better. And it's not like Jalen Brunson's, his track record over the last couple of years with the Knicks is more robust. But I don't know that his credibility on the player rankings over Darius Garland is unassailable or anything like that. It'll be interesting when we do point guard rankings later on in the season. But so for me, I think I have Garland on my second team All-NBA. I spent a little bit of time wondering why I don't have him, why he shouldn't be in this exact same tier, and maybe he is.
Yeah, I think he was to me. I think I would have Brunson a little bit above him in part. These clutch statistics are quite ridiculous. Knicks 16-7 in clutch games that were within 5 points in the last 5 minutes. 64% true shooting on 44% usage. He is the only player who has over 40% usage in the clutch. Shea also has been outstanding. So has Jokic, but overall, Knicks plus 10.9 net rating in the clutch, and they basically just run every single thing through Jalen Brunson. That obviously it's a small sample. He could fall off there, but if we're just crediting what he's done, it's got to be up there. And this is now really almost 3 seasons of Brunson being at or close to this level. So those guys were all on your second team that we've mentioned so far?
Yeah, so I have Mobley with my last first team spot. So the 5 guys that I have for MVP are my top 5 for All-NBA. I don't have necessarily the same criteria, but yeah, Garland, Curry, Brunson are all on my second team, along with Victor Wembanyama. I'm sad that we don't get to have the conversation about Wembanyama versus Evan Mobley for All-NBA really over the full season because Wembanyama is not going to be eligible. But I put him here as a signpost for what he did this year, the most valuable defensive player to me in the NBA this year. And even if I think that some of the all-in-one metrics like EPM are overrating Victor Wembanyama's offense in part because of his turnovers, he has been just a positive player unequivocally. In that respect, it's just how positive has he been. So Wembanyama to be this is going back to the old Rudy Gobert stuff. It's like if you're the defensive player of the year and you're a positive offensive player, you are an all-NBA performer. And Wembanyama would have been in consideration for the 5th spot on my MVP ballot if he had played as much as some of these other guys. Like he could have even made it this time. He just wasn't quite there.
Yeah, I think Wembanyama, what has he played? 45 now of the Spurs.
46.
40. Yeah, he played 46 of the Spurs now, 58 games. So yeah, I guess on a percentage basis, he would still technically be eligible. Again, I just didn't consider him because I know that he's out for a year and he's not going to be eligible. And he was very close to not being eligible even now. Like if he had just gotten hurt yesterday, it's completely fair. I just think of these in part, but it's kind of like my awards morality is like, well, if we're telling the story of the season so far and the story of the season so far, Victor Wembanyama is a huge part of that. The only other person that I have on my second team that we haven't mentioned yet, and I'm guessing will be on yours as well, is Donovan Mitchell. And Mitchell, so that means I have 3 Cavs on the first or second team, which considering how good they are and the players that are driving it, I think is completely fair. Not that this is a team award. Mitchell deserves it on his own merits. But Donovan Mitchell, kind of the case for him, I mean, the Cavs offense has been great when he's been on the floor too, even if it's not that 125, it's 120.4. And
I would say he's a better defender than Garland. Maybe not every possession, not every matchup, but at certain times. And of course, he, like every single Cleveland Cavalier, basically has been effective as an individual scorer. 59% true shooting on 42.7 total creation, 30.6 basketball reference usage, successful 3-point shooter, 40% basically on 10.5 per 36. So to me, he hasn't been the generator of high-level offense to the degree that his teammate Darius Garland has, but I think he merits a second-team inclusion on his own merits.
So this is probably going to be controversial, particularly because I was very down on this gentleman's candidacy the first time that we did awards, but I actually went with LeBron James here. I'm
fine with that personally.
He's been really good on defense the last month and a half or so. I went through it about a week ago of why their defense is not going to continue, and part of that has been opponent shooting luck. But overall, LeBron has really, really been hurt by the shooting luck of both his teammates just making shots when he's off the floor, which usually LeBron James sets up a lot of 3-pointers. He's usually going to help his teammates like that. And then, things like Rui Hachimura is being like 12% higher. Reeves is making like over 10% higher when LeBron is off the floor. So a lot of their shooters just aren't making shots when he's been on the floor. And then opponents also have just been hitting way more shots when he's been on. But this is one where the Lakers are still really good, particularly even during that stretch without AD. And before Luka was healthy again, LeBron just completely carried them. They went on a great winning streak. I think they won 12 of 15, and almost all those were without Davis and without Luka. And I mean, the Lakers are 37-21. Like, they're actually getting to the point where they'll probably be one of my surprise teams of the year. And he's been the biggest driving force of that. And yes, you know what? This is like, when in the financial crisis, I was arguing with some of my friends about because they're like, oh, they did the stimulus and the economy still sucks. And I was like, but how much worse would it suck if they didn't do the stimulus? But like, that's always a tough argument to make. But I think it's worth noting where, given the luck that he's experienced in terms of the shooting of his teammates and opponents when he's been on the floor, the fact that they have actually, like, they are definitely worse, much worse when he is on the floor, and that all the impact metrics don't like that at all. They are actually plus 7.2 when LeBron doesn't play, and they are actually hilariously still slightly negative when he does play. But if it wasn't for him, they would probably be like -10 without him if they just had some other guy in his spot, because the luck has been so bad that it really counteracts everything. And like, ultimately, his individual numbers are very, very good as well. 61% true shooting. He's having one of his biggest creation years from a passing standpoint, 20.8, which is actually the same number as Jokic. He doesn't provide the same high value levels of assists as Jokic does, but still one of the top 5 passers in the league. And I think he's really helped keep things going for this team emotionally as well. I think he's having like one of his better seasons just as a leader. And so this has been, a second team All-NBA performance for LeBron James to me. Also, just because I wasn't like so wowed by the rest of these candidates' statistical resumes beyond him.
Yeah, so I have LeBron on my third team, but I had him. It's not that far difference. Like you, there was kind of you hit a malaise point within All-NBA, which is unfortunate. And that isn't just the restrictions that are on now. It's also just who's been available, who's played well, who hasn't. There are, of course, some notable omissions from All-NBA by their play and their availability so far this year. So I have Donovan Mitchell, second team, last guy on my second team. And then I have LeBron on my third team. The other guy that I felt confident, you've already mentioned him, that should be on an All-NBA team, like there's no way I'm doing this without him, is Jaren Jackson Jr. I believe you had him second team, but I have him third. He's, his resume is fabulous. He definitely deserves it. You could argue he's been better than some of the guys in my second, but I think he's been a little bit worse. And then after that point, I had 3 more spots because I included Victor Wembanyama. I was kind of at the point where it's like, God, they're like 10 guys. I don't really love the case of any of them. I'm really hoping that a couple really take flight during this last 6 weeks of the season and earn a spot on this. And there is definitely the latitude for that. The guy who I guess I put is like the guy that I like the most of that group, but I'm not feeling fantastic about it, is Karl-Anthony Towns. And Towns, his spacing as a big, even if he doesn't take a ton of threes, helps make the Knicks offense work. They have a better offensive rating, 120.7, when he's on the floor than Brunson. So that means they're better in the Towns only minutes than the Brunson only minutes. And the defense is significantly less abysmal than it was earlier in the season. So I don't love the cases historically and presently for offense first centers. I think that they create a lot more problems sometimes than get acknowledged within this. And it's harder to clean up their flaws than it is for other positions because you can't use a center to do that. But I think Towns has been, 64% true shooting, has a large role within the offense. I think he's been good enough to beat my predisposition against players like him.
Yeah, this isn't a playoff rating, and just based on what the Knicks offense has done this year, and this also isn't a rating for only playing games against the top teams in the NBA where Karl-Anthony Towns has been eviscerated on defense. If this is a ranking of the top players in the league, he would certainly be lower to me for the reasons that you discussed. But given his durability, and the Knicks have still been one of the best teams in basketball, I think I feel comfortable with him on the third team. Second team, I wouldn't feel comfortable because I would think his defense is too damaging. I had Donovan Mitchell here. Talked about him already. He would have been at the very top of this group on third team. Kyrie Irving makes this spot for me as well, just with the way that it was ridiculous that he didn't make the All-Star team in the West until he was an injury replacement. And he's just absolutely carried Dallas. The fact that they've managed to be somewhat competitive since the Luka injury, and he's just had to play 40 minutes a game. He's having a solid defensive season, very good in terms of his efficiency. So he could be getting close to not making it if he suffers another injury. But I felt much better about him than, say, Irving would probably be at the bottom of this for me. I don't have this third team in any particular order, but I feel a little bit better about him than Kevin Durant, where things are just completely going off the rails in Phoenix right now. Damian Lillard as well. And then Cade Cunningham, like that, he would probably be the closest one here. I went with Anthony Edwards and Jaylen Williams to fill out my third team instead. But Cade is coming on. I just wasn't quite ready to, I wasn't going to just jump on the, Detroit is the team du jour feeling quite yet. Certainly Cade, if he continues at this rate, will be on my All-NBA team at the end, but he still is below the league average in true shooting. He still turns it over a lot. He doesn't have a ton of help. I acknowledge that. And you look at the roster and you're like, man, he must be amazing for them to be 7 games over 500. But I think a lot of that is the defense. A lot of that is just not playing any bad players. I think JB Bicker's out, the coach. Cade's been awesome. Don't get me wrong. But I do think he is just not quite at the level of efficiency as a scorer and avoiding turnovers for me to feel comfortable with him on All-NBA yet.
I agree. And Cade can absolutely earn his place there. But as you said, it's kind of the reason for the season argument. The Pistons are very good and Cade contributes to the defensive success, but he isn't the reason that they're having it. There are a lot of other things. And we'll probably won't talk about all of those in this podcast, but in subsequent ones. And there are lots of praises to sing for the Pistons. It's so nice to be able to do that. And Cade is a part of that. Yeah, I had Kyrie on as well. You and I have both been a little bit attuned to his case. And as you mentioned, value is a part of this, even if it's not MVP. And he's had to do a lot of lifting. I have grown to appreciate the degree of difficulty part of this argument. And that's actually something that I thought kind of in some ways worked against. KD is just such a weird one because his individual efficiency.
His individual stats are as good as ever, but he wasn't the guy who tried to trade himself, although they were kind of in free fall even before that. And I would say he's been closer to his usual standard maybe than Booker has throughout the season. But we've seen this a lot of times from KD. We've seen other times where he's been able to lift a team. Don't get me wrong. Like obviously his Thunder days when Westbrook was out, or I would say even with the Nets before he was traded, he really did lift that team, although he had also made a trade request that summer. But that team was playing really, really well, and then he went down, and that was the end of his time there. But he just hasn't lifted this team. Like ultimately, Kevin Durant, the Phoenix Suns are negative when he's on the floor. And that's just really hard for me for a team that I consider to be one of the most disappointing of all time. I just couldn't quite get there with him. Whereas I would say Kyrie has been someone amid quite a bit of controversy, shall we say, in Dallas, who has really kept them playing hard, has lifted that team. It's hard for me to make that argument for KD. What did you make of Jalen Williams' candidacy?
He gets my last spot. And I thought that a big part of the reason Jaylen Williams is below league average true shooting, 56%, in part because below 35% on threes, not on a super high volume. And the criticism that I've levied on him a lot over the years that he can't run the show with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander off, which is a valid criticism to me at least. The stretch that resonates with me and to me kind of pushes him, it's a tiebreaker over some of these other dudes, was he got asked to do a lot due to injuries. And like there was a point in this year where whether you were arguing he was playing it functionally or not, he was playing center. He was the tallest dude for the Oklahoma City Thunder in some of these lineups, and it was working. And he has a huge defensive role, whatever the configuration is. And thankfully they have more of Chet and Isaiah Hartenstein in recent vintage than they did earlier in the season. But I have an appreciation for people who have to do that and do a very good job. And again, like you said, and I mean, the Thunder were very good in those stretches. It isn't always with LeBron. It isn't always about how great you are. It's how much did your team need you in that moment? And how well did you step up? And so for me, thinking about Jaylen Williams versus Kevin Durant, the statistical argument is, especially offensively, is in favor of KD, but Jaylen Williams needed to take on these things, which aren't necessarily, I mean, he is a very good defensive player, like the best things he does. And that helped keep them not only afloat, but thriving.
Yeah, like he's willing to do whatever it takes to win. And do I wish he were just a little bit more efficient or just a little bit better as a passer? Yes, I do. And I think the numbers with him on the floor and Shai off offensively are not very good. Now, of course, they don't really have any other, or at least throughout the season, maybe if we were playing with Chet playing center, it might be different, but they don't really have any other offensive players either. Like it's not his fault that there's no one else who can dribble. He's not necessarily a point guard. Like he is a number 2 on offense who's being asked to step into a number 1 and with a bunch of number 4s and 5s next to him. But yeah, like I acknowledge that he is not really capable of performing that role the way that you would want. And I still have that concern overall for the Thunder, but he's just a really, really good player in basically every respect. One of probably the best defender at the wing position of any of these guys that we've been talking about. Maybe Tatum would be his only competition in that regard. And he still is definitely a solid shooting threat, even though he hasn't made quite as many from the outside this year. 56% shooting allowed at the rim with that 7'2" wingspan. And he's just willing to switch on to anybody. He's strong. He competes. Great transition player. He's a huge part of why the Thunder are one of the best transition teams on offense and the best transition team on defense. So and just ultimately still a 9.4 net rating when he's on the floor. And this OKC team, as I mentioned, is really dominant, and a lot of that is their defense and their depth. But I think far be it for me to ever fall into this, okay, we have to reward the players on this team. But I'm also okay with that just being a tie break, particularly when you're looking at like some of these tire fire teams for some of his competition.
There
So
was
you said everyone. Is there anyone that who are we? I had Edwards on there. Do you have Edwards on there?
I did not. I had Wembanyama. I think that's where we.
Yeah. Okay. So so that's actually our one difference. Amazingly. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I was close on a bunch of other guys. I'll mention briefly that like some of the guys that the all-in-one stats really like that we weren't as much on. Franz Wagner. That's the elevating to like to a lower mid-level offense thing. Sabonis.
Yeah.
It's
also only played 40 games.
Yes. Sabonis. To me, I mean, we've said the Sabonis thing a lot. He's been effective as an individual player. The Kings have been there. Let's see. Anybody? I'm thinking people just so we can address it with the omissions.
Yeah. Well, Sabonis also worth noting. He really benefits in these impact metrics on defense because they just haven't had any other centers. They've spent a bunch of time playing.
Yes.
Trey Lyles or Alex Len or just a bunch of like perish the thought type of guys. So the idea that, and again, like he competes defensively, but if you're going to try to say that defense is like part of Domantas Sabonis's all NBA case, no, I'm sorry. That is not true. And yeah, even with, because again, like this is probably the biggest quibble that I have with a lot of the all-in-one metrics is that, yeah, they think, Domantas Sabonis, if you look at like, so especially if you add it up in terms of the like EPM, like equivalent wins, or like, actually, no, I think Sabonis is like, among the players who are eligible, he's like 4th or 5th in EPM. But yeah, he's like a positive 1.5 defensive EPM. I don't believe that that's true. And then just overall, like if you're not pushing your team to a high enough height, and it's not like the Kings have like no other talent around him either. They're a plus 4.1 when he's in the floor. Like that's pretty good, but that's just like compared to someone like a Mobley or something. Like I have no understanding of like how Domantas Sabonis is ahead of Evan Mobley in EPM when Mobley has a 15.3 net rating. Like I realize that the Cavs are shooting it really well. They have a bunch of other good players, but like Evan Mobley to me is just a completely different class of player than Sabonis. And I think a lot of these metrics just look like, oh, they're terrible when he's off the floor. And I think that is given a little bit too much credence versus what you're doing when he's actually on the floor.
And I'll mention the Rockets are 37-23. They don't have anybody all NBA. They don't even have anybody I seriously considered for it. And that's just a testament to how good they are as a team. They're doing it in different ways. I don't think Van Vliet or Şengün really has a persuasive case to be in this conversation, but I wanted to mention it because I'm sure some people will think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a Rocket on my All-Star team, I don't think.
Yeah, I wouldn't have either.
All right, that's our All-NBA teams. Yeah, a few more apologies to Damian Lillard. I thought his case was pretty similar to Irving, but that Irving is just way better defensively than Lillard is. And Lillard particularly, I think he's just really inconsistent at this point in his career. He's gotten some nagging injuries. That also really hurts his defense. I mean, I agree. I think this is a pretty weak crop overall of All-NBA, but we don't have Wembanyama, or at least I didn't. No Luka Doncic, no AD. Like those are three guys who perpetually are going to be at least on the second team, and if not even in contention for first team. All right, let's get to executive of the year now. And because just so much has happened since the trade deadline, we last did this in January, and we will have to discuss it. I think that because I know you have limited time, so I wanted to make sure that we fleshed out this discussion in full.
Well, listeners will know that I said pretty openly after the trade deadline that Rob Pelinka would be my executive of the year, and that it wasn't necessarily about how the Lakers performed after the trade. It was about what happened, my belief of Luka Doncic as a player, and the limited amount they had to give up to make that trade happen. Nothing remotely has affected that judgment. In fact, it has been bolstered by, of course, how well the Lakers played.
Not by, yeah. I mean, the Lakers have played well, but also, I mean, I would say something has affected it, but just the magnitude of the Luka thing is so high that it can't overcome. I mean, he completely fucked up the trade deadline. Like they made the Mark Williams trade. They totally overpaid. I hated that trade for them. And yeah, they, whether it was buyer's remorse or they really did find something, or whatever. But then it was too late to get any kind of other center in there, even just this Lakers team, like, especially as well as they played, like, if they had a real center, even, a couple of, like, a Clint Capella type of guy, would they be a championship threat? Maybe not, but they just don't have a chance with this group right now. I know some people are saying they do. No, they will not be able to defend well enough. Redick is doing a great job with smoke and mirrors. Their effort level is really high, but as I noted, they've been way over their head in terms of opponent shooting luck recently. And the idea of just let's pack the paint with a bunch of guys who can't protect the rim because we just got to, and we'll just let opponents bomb away from the outside. Like, that's not going to get you through.
Well, and briefly, since I, haven't been on the last few weeks, something that I've noticed in the limited amount of basketball I've watched is that these sorts of strategies actively, while they can work to win your regular season games and all that, the other huge problem the Lakers run into beyond just regression to the mean for these opponent shooters is that the increase in opponent talent level as the playoffs move on. So the idea, like, the Lakers can absolutely win a series, but I don't think they can win 3. Probably, I don't think they can win 4, because you're going to run into somebody.
You can't beat Cleveland or Boston just saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to pack the paint, shoot as many threes as you want." Like, that's not going to work.
And probably not going to make it out of the West either. But I still, do you agree with me?
It might work. It might work against OKC, actually, or against Denver. I don't know. Those two teams, like, they're actually not great shooting teams in the West. We'll see. I just wish they had, like, even a semi-competent center.
Even with the Mark Williams thing, and the, or more, for phrase more accurately, the insufficiency at center, which because remember, they could have just not done the Mark Williams trade irrespective of the rescindment and just gotten somebody else, which I probably would have.
That's what I'm saying. And they forfeited that chance to do what would have been a bad trade, and then they had to rescind it.
Yes. And then, but I still have him number 1. And because if you can acquire a generational talent at a young age, you're going to get this anyway. And if you could do it without giving up the whole farm, then you're in pretty much, and that without the leverage, because the player did like what Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did, where it's just like, I want to go and I want to go there. Like, that is, he got that kind of a deal despite not having that sort of a reason. And I mean, there are a lot of explanations and all of the hagiography that have come out since for how and why that happened. But this is the type of thing that that you have to award.
I mean, I'll give him credit for a couple of things. One is obviously just having the relationship. As much as you might decry that as nepotism or whatever, like, that's part of what being a GM is having a relationship so the other guy trusts you. Like, Nico Harrison trusted him. Jeannie Buss just talked about this. Like, that's part of why they're able to get the deal done. And then the other thing too is, I think a lot of GMs might have been like, well, if we can't talk to him first and know that he wants to stay here and he would extend, like, how can we give up someone like Anthony Davis and all this package? It sure as hell helps to be in LA and be the Lakers, but he still was willing to take that chance, and having no idea how Luka felt. And I mean, hey, it's not written in stone yet. Like, maybe it could blow up in his face. Everything's going great so far, obviously, that Luka could leave potentially, but it still was, even if he does leave, is 100% a risk worth taking. So yeah, he's my number 1. I think you and I disagreed on this last time. I had Sam Presti, like, a very clear number 2. The Caruso trade, especially when you see what Josh Giddey's been doing this year, was an absolute heist, even though Caruso hasn't played that much. But then Hartenstein has been a total lifesaver with Chet going down. And that wasn't necessarily like a conventional move. I would have thought they just needed some more help on the wing. There weren't necessarily those players available in free agency, but he just went and got the best player in free agency. He did it on a contract structure that's not going to affect their long-term books, but still totally outbid what the Knicks could do to bring him back. And then Hartenstein, even without Chet, they were playing as one of the best teams of all time. If he doesn't make those moves in the offseason, yes, they had a lot of assets, but they didn't give up any of their assets.
They didn't.
Like, that's the biggest thing. yeah, you could have gotten some guys, but he didn't have to. He used the cap space, and then he also just traded away a guy who completely wasn't in their plans anymore in Giddey, and now they've got one of the best teams ever. Whereas if he doesn't make those moves, they're probably kind of more mired in this mix, still fighting for the 1 seed, and now they're just going to be able to coast down the stretch.
All of that.
And also the Wiggins and Joe deals, I think, were really good deals too, just to get some matching salary, but also get some good players on contracts long term. They were both at least mildly in our discussion for best contracts that Dan and I did.
They were, and I think that Presti's case for executive of the year, like the ballot, is very strong. I still have my criticisms of his trade deadline as the mock Thunder did slightly differently than the actual Thunder, as they often do. But you're right that without those decisions, the Thunder would be in a worse place. And to do that without sacrificing future treasure is a real win. I still, as I did then, have Kobe Altman above Sam Presti, and that was our disagreement, and I think it will still be one. Because one of the most important things that an executive has to do as the coach, Sam Presti had already made the right decision there with Mark Daigneault, and I don't think that he did anything wrong. But Kobe Altman, it was 2 decisions: one, to let go of JB Bickerstaff, and then to bring in Kenny Atkinson. And I think both of those, as well as JB Bickerstaff is doing with the Pistons, were both important and somewhat difficult and successful decisions, because Atkinson has given this team different life. He's restructured the rotation, and that combines with another, kind of the ways that decisions can be underappreciated, the decision to keep all of their core guys together. And Donovan Mitchell being willing to extend, of course, made that easier, but he bet that Darius Garland was going to have a better year than the super weird 23-24, and that was correct. I mean, Garland is in MVP ballot consideration. And then I would argue that their deadline bolstered this. And even though it's been on a relatively low usage, DeAndre Hunter has made a ton of shots since he got there. But it's more the thing that I've really ruminated on since the trade deadline, in part because it happened in the form of these swaps that were already swapped, is that really what Kobe Altman gave up was a lot of Dan Gilbert's money. I think that was the biggest thing that they gave up in that deal. And DeAndre Hunter is a luxury, but to convince the owner to be willing to spend the money that they're going to have to presumably to retain him. I've worked on a piece with Jason Lloyd for The Athletic about kind of how that's going to work moving forward. That is a part of the job too. And so for me, I'm fine with you having Presti over Altman. And if we were doing tiers for executive of the year, they'd be in the same tier for me. But those decisions could have gone so wrong. And with your argument being persuasive, I think that Altman deviating from the path he did would have been more damaging to the Cavs' present and future than Presti deviating from his.
Yeah, Altman, especially the DeAndre Hunter thing, has certainly bolstered the situation as well. And the Atkinson hire was very solid for the organization. He's in the mix for me, and throw a few other candidates out there.
Sure.
I think Rafael Stone's work is looking better and better. Didn't do anything of note at the trade deadline, but I thought the Şengün extension has looked outstanding. That was one that Dan and I talked about as a possibility for best contract. Even if Şengün hasn't played that well, just getting him at below the max when basically no other team would have been able to do that. And to secure the Rockets' book so that if they want to, they can just bring back Fred VanVleet on that team option next year is really solid. Reed Shepherd at 3. I liked the pick a lot. He's done absolutely nothing, but as we'll get to, neither has anyone else. And so I still probably would have taken Reed Shepherd there. But this is what I wanted to talk through with you. And you probably didn't listen to this, but I talked about it with Dan the other day. There was an executive texted me that it's possible that the Phoenix pick that the Rockets traded for to give the Nets their own pick back could actually end up being better than the Nets pick does.
It's possible. With Matt Ishbia as the owner, I think that I'm
No, I'm
always
talking about this year.
this year. Oh, you're right.
This year.
Yeah.
Because that's what they traded,
That's
right? They
right.
traded back 2025 and then the swap
That's
in
right.
26. And then they got
That's right.
3 years of Phoenix picks. And they got Dallas in 29 also. Or I guess the two best of Phoenix, Dallas, and Brooklyn
That's right.
in 29. So they may have actually gotten a better pick back just in 25 and then also gotten 3 more picks.
That's a really good point. I'd forgotten about that wrinkle with everything.
I could, because the 25 aspect of it, we're just like, oh yeah, whatever. Like, obviously, who cares about the Suns 25 pick? But that's pretty remarkable. Yeah, so that's one I wanted to throw out. And I think even the Jaylen Green deal, I think, is looking decent. He's had good moments, he's had bad moments this year, but he's been a little bit better, and I think they feel very good about that deal, and there's still a possibility he could get even better, and he also will be totally decent matching salary if they need to make a move.
I want to mention some quick ones. Not to saying they would have been top 3 for me, but just to praise them. Lawrence Frank deciding not to give Paul George everything looks a whole lot better now than it did when I lampooned him for that months ago.
Yep, it does.
Pat Riley, as much as it really messed with the Heat season, he got more for Jimmy Butler than I expected at the deadline.
Well, on the PG thing, I guess PG's been hurt. I got asked about this in my chat the other day. Like, he's had a lot of injuries this year. Obviously, he's been pretty bad. I think it's fair to assume that he wouldn't have been the same player that he was last year, when I thought he was very solidly in All-NBA consideration even last year. But the Clippers still don't have any of their picks going forward here. They would have had to be in the second apron to bring him back. That is true. But they actually might be kind of interesting if they had held on to him. Like, as a team this year, they probably would be a top 4 seed again. They have more flexibility, obviously, now. Kawhi had his return has been pretty halting. Like, I'm not that encouraged with the idea that he can get back to being who he was last year before he got hurt. So if Kawhi actually were on that level, I might be like, maybe you actually should have brought him back, even though Paul's been very much at the low end of his range in Philly. I guess I'll have to cross Daryl Morey off my possible executive of the year. Moving down
I have him on a possible executive of the year list. It's just not this one.
So, but no, I mean, obviously the outcome for the Clippers is better not having signed to that deal.
I don't think that he should be in consideration for the rest of their offseason, but I want to mention that Zach Kleiman and the Grizzlies drafted the guys who I have top 2 for Rookie of the Year, and they didn't do it with high picks. They did it with a late lottery pick and a second rounder. And they didn't fire Taylor Jenkins. I don't love a lot of the other things they did, but that was I mentioned Pat Riley. And then I'm sure there will be a lot of praise, and I think he deserves a fair amount of it, for Trajan Langdon. I mean, the Pistons are so much better than they were. However, I thought they did a relatively poor job using the leverage that they had as one of the few cap space teams. And I brought this up at the time, but how valuable is this trade to other teams? They got too little from the Mavericks in the Tim Hardaway Jr. deal and a few other transactions. So I think that the Pistons being this much better and, everything else, and hiring JB Bickerstaff, Langdon did a lot right. But to me, he didn't do enough to be top 3. And I'm sure there'll be people who vote for him for executive of the year because of how much better the Pistons are.
Yeah, and also Malik Beasley was an absolute coup. There's an argument that he's been the Pistons' second best player, but they also got him for 1 year, $6 million. Great job getting him for $6 million, but only 1 year. They would love to have him on a longer term deal now, I would imagine. Maybe they can figure out a way to pay him after this, but I thought that they actually should have been more aggressive in trying to get good players on reasonable contracts of the type that I thought were available. So a few others I'll throw out there. Mike Dunleavy, he was very high in his offseason. Then DeAnthony Melton gets hurt. Obviously a possibility when you sign DeAnthony Melton in the state that he was in, and Kyle Anderson didn't really work out. They were foundering around 500 for a long time. Guys just weren't producing the way they had been expected to, even though I liked a lot of those players. And then he's now makes the trade for Butler with Butler in the lineup. I think they are 6-1, although Butler did miss that Sixers loss with back spasms, and that's part of the Butler experience. And they also gave Jimmy Butler a big extension. So that's like, I want to just acknowledge him that it is something that could work out, that everyone seems really happy now they got Butler. They're relevant again. But of course, this is the honeymoon period. Many of the reasons that we were more down on that deal than some, and particularly giving Butler the extension, those chickens haven't come home to roost yet. Sean Marks, I'd feel a lot better about what he did if they just had lost a few more games. But hey, pretty good coach hire with Jordy Fernandez. Somehow they keep, like, he really is just like Will Hardy East at this point. Tanking team. They just keep trying to denude the roster, and he just finds some new combinations that actually make them respectable. How about how do you see it with the Spurs exec Brian Wright, RC Buford, whoever you want to call it?
I think they did a number of things right. You know, getting that swap with Sacramento for to be a facilitator in and to get Harrison Barnes, who has of course helped them. But the reason why I don't have the Spurs in this consideration is that I think that they did a lot to help their present that won't help their future, and that is enough to be positive, potentially, but it's not enough to really move it. And so if I felt a little bit better about Stephon Castle, the one that you and I are going to talk about.
No, it's as bad as everyone's been. Like, it's hard for me to knock the Castle pick.
No, but then the other one is the one, like, we're going to talk about.
He's at least shown some upside and some potential, which a lot of these guys have shown nothing.
Sure. Well, we'll have time to talk about that later on.
Okay.
And then, not later on in this pod, but in future pods. And then the other thing we'll talk about in future pods is the decision with what became the Rob Dillingham pick, and like how all that works out moving forward and everything else. So, like, for me, the idea the Spurs are markedly better. Of course, the Wembanyama news is extremely disheartening, and that they did nothing wrong in that respect. Nobody did. But for me, my lens with when you already have your focal point, my lens is their best time, and like Chris Paul is not going to be on the team. He probably won't be in the NBA, period. It would be stunning if he were. And then Harrison Barnes won't be on the team. He might not be in the NBA at that point. And so if the best guys you added aren't going to be there for that time, to me, that's a sugar high.
Yeah, I think they did a lot of good things for the long term. The swap with the Kings was really good. Like, there were not that was just a straight salary dump that they got. They've consistently managed to get first round assets, usually in the form of a swap, but still out of straight salary dumps. Nobody else is getting those these days. And I think the Wizards, the Wizards got one in the Smart deal, right? Like, but that's a very low pick from Memphis this year. And then I thought the price they paid in the Fox deal was really good to send the Bulls back their pick. I thought that was top 10 protected anyway, and who knew whether it was ever going to really even convey, frankly. The Bulls really would have wanted it to not to convey, but I don't know if they're actually competent enough to get to where they need to be, and to just identify the Bulls, like make that deal happen, to get Zach LaVine to the Kings, and just not really give up very much in that Fox deal. My greater trepidation with the Fox deal is, well, all right, if they give him the max extension, what's the opportunity cost that? We haven't seen what that extension is going to be. My assumption is it's going to be the max, but certainly they traded for the best player that's ever been traded to the Spurs, at least unless you're going to count Kawhi Leonard in a draft day deal, which doesn't really count. So that was really solid to me. And getting Chris Paul, I think that was really good for their culture and their leadership. Would I have liked it if maybe they're a little shittier and they were still in position now and they hadn't traded for Fox and they're in position to really be getting a top 6, top 7 pick? They could still move up in the draft with the flattened lottery odds. So I don't know what to think about. He's not in my top 3, but it's a very interesting discussion to me with those Spurs executives of like, I think they've done largely pretty well. And like even Castle, not a great fit with Fox, but clearly is talented. And there are a lot of guys with no talent who got drafted in that range, including some guys that I shouldn't say no talent, but guys who aren't looking very good. So anyone else you wanted to shout out before I pick my number 3 here?
No, I'm good.
All right. I think you convinced me on Kobe Altman. I will go there. All right. Well, we've talked about Nico Harrison way too much. We don't need to rehash that. I would say we've done podcasts and podcasts and podcasts about why he is not executive of the century. Let's move on to the second place in this illustrious designation.
If Elgin Baylor was once described as a lottery veteran on an NBA broadcast, Arturas Karnisovas is a not executive of the year veteran, and he has earned a spot.
He's a play-in veteran too.
He is a play-in veteran too. And so I think that, like, so to run through it a little bit, I mean, so, and remember that this doesn't include the sins of the past with DeRozan and Caruso, but it does include the present sins with those two individuals. So that means with Alex Caruso, they traded him for Josh Giddey, and that has been more in line with our evaluation of Josh Giddey than what I assume Arturas's evaluation of Josh Giddey was. They also,
and then they didn't extend it. Are you giving him positive points for not extending Giddey?
I am giving him points for not extending.
Kind of am, but also it's like it's so ad hoc.
It's so preliminary points because I also think they're going to overpay him in restricted free agency anyway, which will not be a part of this grade rigidly. Then with DeRozan,
why would they do that? They held the line so well on Patrick Williams.
We'll see.
Although, in fairness, they did do well on Kobe White. I will give them credit for that.
They did. And so that's one. And then with DeMar DeRozan, they letting him get to free agency. That's out of this grading window. But they moved him. They didn't bring him back. They moved him, but because they were so inflexible, they couldn't get the swap with Sacramento. The most valuable asset in that trade didn't go to them and instead went to another team that took a player that I believed was a positive value contract who incidentally would have helped the Bulls should you want to be helped in their case. So they did that. And then they got, the Zach LaVine rehabbing his value. Like, I mean, even if it's not what it was a couple of years ago, I'm not the biggest fan of what they got back in that deal. As you mentioned in the discussion with the Spurs eligibility for executive of the year, it's kind of a weird asset. And the Bulls, and they also didn't do the other stuff that I thought would have been really necessary. They didn't move Vucevic, so now they still have his contract for next year, all that type of stuff. So I think that it isn't as oh man, they really set the franchise back. I don't think there are any of those true, the rest of the ones that I'm going to talk about, these aren't horrendous off seasons, but I do think that his was the next worst.
Yeah, I think the Bulls had the worst process. We mentioned the Patrick Williams 5 for 90, someone who can't stay healthy and has under 50% true shooting on the year is miserable. Not trading any of the other guys at the deadline. Now Ayo Dosunmu is out for the year with a shoulder issue. They surely could have gotten something for him. I thought they should have checked in on White. And the fact that they traded for their pick back to push hard to make the 10th seed is just, it absolutely kills me. The fact that they couldn't have gotten a better asset, that their pick was already top 10 protected. They're in position to keep that pick, and that they instead are oh, thank God we got this pick back at the exclusion of maybe getting back some other assets.
Sure.
So that it was viewed as a positive, oh, thank God, now we can go chase the 11th seed in the lottery. That was the big benefit of the LaVine trade. And so they're probably, they might get some lottery luck because even if they make the play-in, since that 10th seed in the East is going to have such a terrible record, they'll be below a bunch of teams in the West. They'll actually have okay odds of moving up still. But nonetheless, they shouldn't be quote unquote trying the way they are. If they could have moved Vucevic for anything, they should have done that. Jalen Smith, paying him $10 million a year, no thanks. That's not really working out. I didn't hate that one at the time, but that hasn't worked either. So yeah, really hard to point to anything that they've done well. Daryl Morey, I was completely on board with every single thing he did, and if I were running the Sixers, I would probably be on the hot seat too, because none of that shit has worked.
And it's not only just the Joel Embiid extension and Paul George having a really rough year. It's
the Joel one is the one that I think you have to go back and be like, oh man, that was probably a pretty bad decision. But the rest of them, I think at the time it looked decent.
Yeah, and even like Caleb Martin, which we thought was an absolute heist, and then that didn't work out super well. Though part of the reason I have Morey in the, let's call it, dishonorable mention rather than in the 3 spot. I'll explain who I have there. They did some other things like getting Quentin Grimes at the deadline. I think that could really help them.
Yep.
And he's restricted like those. I think and Jared McCain. I mean, he was to me he's the most outstanding rookie, even if he's not going to play enough to be eligible to actually win Rookie of the Year. And so. And we'll see with some of these, like Yabusele was a good identification. He has outperformed his contract in a way that will make it hard to retain him. So yeah, and I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the I agreed with it and it hasn't worked idea than the other stuff. Maybe that's to my own detriment as an analyst. A couple others that I want to mention before I get to my actual number 3. Joe Cronin, as much as the Blazers are doing well now, and I like a lot of that stuff, like not making a Jeremy Grant trade, like that pumpkin may just be a pumpkin for forever.
This
now.
is more towards the offseason, but yeah, they should have moved Simons and Grant in the offseason.
Yeah, but that's accounted. That's part of the year. That's part of the year.
Yeah, but just to be clear, that I think the ship had kind of sailed by the deadline.
Yes, agreed. I mean, I don't think they could have gotten positive value for him at that point. Then a few others I want to mention. So David Griffin, there are 2 parts of this. One is the DeJounte Murray deal looking so much worse now. And I'm not even talking about the injury. I'm just how badly he played. That will come up for me if we get to most disappointing player. Jeff Weltman, it's the moves that he didn't make, not bringing in a potential offensive engine that,
and the one he did make too. I mean, he's got a guy who can't hit a shot, starting at the 2 that they're paying $22 million a year to, and
that's
with
right.
A player option in a couple of years. I mean, that again, this shit is pretty hard. I will say, like, many of these moves and many of these guys we're talking about moves that when we analyzed it at the time, we thought they were pretty good. Now, so some of the the reason to me why Arturas is number 2 is we thought it was obvious at the time that the moves were bad, and guess what? They were bad.
Right.
Whereas some of these, I think they did as well as you reasonably could. But hey, this is a results-oriented business. We'll give you a little bit of credit for the fact that it seemed like a good move at the time, but we can't give you too much because you did sign Joel Embiid with apparently no left knee to a ridiculous extension. Even though, again, at the time I was like, all right, well, where are you going if you don't sign to this anyway? But given what they must have known about his knee, then I think it's actually, this is kind of interesting too, just as a quick aside. Sham said that there was a disconnect between Joel and the organization. It seemed like the organization almost was like more positive on Joel's knee than he was. So maybe that was part, like, they've been feeling like, oh, if he just plays more, gets back into shape, like things will be better. Whereas Joel's like, nah, something's wrong. But so that is kind of interesting, but I think I would tend to side with Joel rather than the organization, because it clearly is not working. Whatever the scans show, but perhaps the organization could have been a little more conservative given the fact that he's running out of meniscus and the fact that they say it's not totally gone. That's the party line right now. But what else are they going to say? And then he just, they should have had an idea that he probably wasn't going to be ready to start the season, but some of that's his decision rather than the organization's. But it just obviously turned out terribly. Same thing with PG and even Andre Drummond, all these. So sorry for that aside.
No, it's fine. Also, running out of meniscus, not a terrible band name. If anybody wants to take it. Briefly to go back to David Griffin, they did eventually move Brandon Ingram. More on that in a second. But kind of going into, I think and I don't know if we'll get to the DeJounte Murray part of this, like in most disappointing player, he factors prominently for me. But I think that some of the bad process for the Pelicans gets lost in just how much of a disaster their season was. Like, I think it papers over. Like, we're thinking about all these other things instead of that because of how badly that's gone. But they were like, even if they were healthy, they had these flaws. I still support the Trey Murphy extension and, some of the other stuff, but they didn't do anything with CJ McCollum. They didn't do anything with Ingram, though they did eventually move him. So like, I wanted to mention it, but the person who is my number 3 is not the person who didn't trade Ingram initially. It's the person who traded for him eventually. And I can't remember who wrote this. I would give them praise, but I think it might've been, I think it was either Mark Stein or Jake Fisher but it might've been in a Bontemps piece. That's why I don't remember for sure. This idea that Masai Ujiri, and part of this is outside the grading window, he acquired Emmanuel Quickly previously, and then Brandon Ingram, and basically paid high-end value in terms of salaries for them. In Ingram's case, on an extension before he played in a single game for them Quickly pretty early on. And I brought this up at the trade deadline, that to me, it's just a fundamental disconnect between me and what Ujiri and the Raptors have done, where they're now this pretty shockingly expensive team that just isn't particularly interesting to me. They don't have the high level upside. They don't have salary flexibility to change things in the near term. And so for me, I'm more critical of that than I am like Daryl Morey doing things I agreed with and them actively not working out. Though I completely understand that Morey's things worked out worse for Morey. So I don't know how to adjudicate that fully.
Yeah, some people would say with what the Sixers did that your expected outcome would be that it was terrible. Now we're not even way on the low end of that. They're now going to be fighting to keep their top 6 protected pick. I don't think anyone saw that, but yeah, Daryl always says, 5% chance of winning the championship. Like that's worth going for. And, generally, only 1 out of 30 teams wins and all that. Yeah, I mean, certainly David Griffin has to be up there. You give him a pass for one of the most injured years that I can remember, but certainly the fact that his prize acquisition was so bad, another move that I was like kind of okay with, frankly. James Jones has probably got to be in this too, now again, made a bunch of moves over the offseason that I thought were pretty good, but everything around the trade deadline was just a disaster. The trading of the 31 pick to end up doing nothing, at least as of now, but facilitating a salary dump of Yusuf Nurkic, to make that deal without having a Beal destination in play. They pissed off Beal, then they managed to piss off KD as well without actually knowing that they had a deal for him. And then there was still a point where he was able to squash it. And now he's going to be going into the offseason with much more ability to determine where he's going to go, and their return for him is going to be a lot worse. I actually think things have gone so poorly that they should have just moved on for everybody. They should have been gauging what they could have gotten for Devin Booker. So this weird half measure, like everything is completely failed. They're not a contender. That's totally done. But then they also have missed at least one chance to possibly rebuild. They've pissed off the guy who is basically the emotional bellwether of the team. If they wanted to keep this group together, well, what's the point of that when you've now pissed off KD, and a pissed off KD is going to torpedo your season? And they haven't even thought about moving Booker at all.
Well, and
none of these other moves have worked.
There's one other big move that we haven't talked about, which is another thing that bolsters his case, and we didn't expect it, which is, they brought in Mike Budenholzer, and I picked their over in part because it's I believe that he was good. And
Ryan was saying today, people are talking about him potentially getting fired. There's this thing that came out where Mike Budenholzer supposedly told Devin Booker to be less vocal, and then he passive aggressively talked about that in a presser. It's just, it's one of the most disappointing seasons of all time. Clearly, the executive and the owner, and what are you going to say? It's Josh Barlstein or Jones or Ishbia, whoever you want to give the demerit to there.
Yeah. So I think. So you haven't responded to my Masai Ujiri thing. Do you think that's reasonable, or do you think I'm overplaying it?
I haven't loved it, but I think that there are just many more qualified candidates. I mean, even and it's too bad we don't do this after the playoffs, but like Tim Connolly and Leon Rose are pretty interesting ones here too.
Sure.
Like Tim Connolly, another one that we liked. Leon Rose, like it was looking pretty good, but then they've been totally hopeless against good teams. I don't know that Mitchell Robinson is going to be their savior, even though he's come back right now. Pat Riley did get Kelleher in the draft, who I like, but obviously the Butler thing was mismanaged. Although I mean, certainly from an emotional standpoint, it was. I still don't think they should have given him the contract, and it truly did, of course, all stem from that. But that completely devolved into a circus, and that wasn't entirely. Pat was not entirely blameless on that. We'll put that, but
I'll phrase it this way: I have Riley closer to executive of the year than not executive of the year, because I don't think that it hurt that the dynamic with Riley and Jimmy. I don't think that it hurt their 24-25 season quite as much. Like, it definitely made them chaotic, but like as a functional perspective, I think they'd probably be a lot closer to like the 4-5-6 if that was the case. But like, I mean, it's not like they would have been fighting they wouldn't be 40-20 fighting with the Knicks.
Yeah, I think ultimately I'm going to go with David Griffin here. So Harrison 1, Arturas 2, David Griffin 3, and apologies to Joe Cronin, James Jones. Actually, you know what? Nah, I'm going to go James Jones. The fact that they made that deal with Utah without having something else, and that everything was constantly leaking to, I mean, it just like wasn't a professional way to handle things. Like you get your ducks in a row before you make a move like that, and they just had exactly the opposite, and they managed to just whatever chance they had of being even remotely respectable this year, they totally sabotaged that by everything that happened at the deadline. Plus, and they also now are out there unprotected 2031.
Plus, James Jones did such a weird job with this Suns team that they may facilitate the Mavericks still making the play-in despite having no healthy centers. Like, if you make things better for Nico Harrison, then that hurts you too.
All right, we got about 20 minutes left here. Let's see if we can bang through the rest of these. Let's go to Defensive Player of the Year. And yeah, Wembanyama no longer in consideration for me.
I still had him number 1, but we don't need to go through it. Even though he deserves the praise, we've already done a lot of it.
Yeah. And so let's talk then. My number 1 was Evan Mobley. Gave you a lot of his case. The one thing you might point to is that his opponent's shooting at the rim is 58.1%, which is that's about average number for a center. And he does play some power forward too, and he plays probably half his minutes at center, half at power forward, but 32% contest percentage is really, really good considering that positional mix. For example, Jaren Jackson Jr., who's up there as well, Jaren's contest percentage is 7 percentage points below that.
Right.
And again, I kind of explained in the NBA stuff why I think Mobley is the superior defender to Jaren. And so I actually had Jaren second, and actually went Rudy Gobert third. I think he was in the mix for me the first time around. Fell off because Victor was so good and Mobley and Jackson were on the rise. But I think Zubats was the one guy who is closest in the mix to me. Perimeter players, I just can't really get you into the top 5 for this sort of an award. They might make the lower end of my all defense that's positionless. But yeah, Rudy Gobert, like his numbers are like still pretty goddamn good. Even though I know the brand isn't great, Minnesota's brand isn't great. Like they've defended exceedingly well when he's played. It's just really that they can't stop anyone when he's off the floor. It's been their big problem.
Gobert's opponents are shooting only below 51% on the shots that he contests. That's a
yeah,
low
and that number has also gotten a lot better.
It has.
We last checked in.
And I will say I had Ivica Zubac over Gobert in part because they have really different the contest rates. So Zubac is basically contesting about 7% more shots. That's a huge difference. And the Clippers weirdly have opponents are shooting a high percentage on shots in the restricted area when Zubac is on the floor, but it's like all in the shots he's not contesting and the attempt rate is low. So I think there are two factors in there. One is they don't have a lot of size at the other spots. The other is that when you take fewer shots at the rim, so the Clippers, when Zubac is on the floor, Clippers opponents take 28.5 shots per 100 at the rim. That's pretty much the lowest of anybody in real contention here. My theory is that the ones that you thin out, that means that a higher proportion are going to be in transition, like the gimmies or the close to gimmies, because there's only so much you can do to take those away. It's a theory I have. I'd be very interested to see somebody smart work through that. And for Zubac, other than that rim protection, other than the shots that he doesn't contest going in, the Clippers are strong when he's on the floor, and all of the other classic math problem stuff. They don't foul a lot. They get a ton of defensive rebounds. So he has a pretty good traditional case. So I had Wembanyama first. I had Mobley second. I had Zubac third. But like you, I mean, Jaren's in serious consideration. Gobert, I like that you had him there. Brook Lopez, I'd say, has a weaker version of Rudy Gobert's case. But, it's the classic centers. Centers change the shots opponents take. They can make them harder, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's pretty much all the players that I seriously considered.
Yeah, Gobert and Zubac to me were very close to one another, and I just felt like Gobert has a little bit more mobility than Zubac does, and that's why I gave the tie to him. And yeah, Jaren, just to go through his case a little bit, it was better than I thought it was going to be. It has gotten better. 107.2 Memphis Grizzlies defensive rating when he's on the floor, second best of any of these candidates beside Ivica Zubac. And then the fact that he can still guard on the perimeter too. Like I don't love that he can't really be relied on to be the full-time center, as I talked about with Mobley, but the opponent rim field goal percentage has gotten way better. His contest percentage has been steadily rising throughout the season. And this isn't a Memphis Grizzlies team that has other great defenders. They don't really have a traditional wing defender. Like Jaylen Wells is probably the closest thing they have there, at least who's been available this season. And they're playing other guys, like Santi Aldama, like Brandon Clark is only okay. Like Jaren is really the guy who's driving all of this for them. So that's why I had him at 2. And yeah, Bam Adebayo just doesn't have the statistical case this year. Davis hasn't played enough games, also doesn't really have a great statistical case. And yeah, Brook Lopez, I think, just continues to fall off a little bit every year in terms of his mobility. What's our next category?
As we continue to avoid Rookie of the Year, let's go to Coach of the Year. And as always, there are a lot of deserving candidates. I'll focus because there are a lot of people who deserve praise, but we're trying to move through this because, time is of the essence. For me, the top 3, with apologies to a billion guys, were in no particular order. Taylor Jenkins, I brought this up before, the Grizzlies being close to top 5 on both offense and defense. They're currently 6th and 8th as we record this. Considering their available talent is really impressive. That 8th in defense, you brought up Jaren Jackson, but just the Memphis has eroded their overall defensive player quality a lot over the years, and I think that's gone underappreciated, but they're still doing very well there. And 6th on offense when Ja has missed a portion of the season and hasn't been as great as he sometimes is. That's important. Ime Udoka, he's not creative on offense, but them being 13th with their talent, I think is impressive. They have such limited shooting. They're crashing the glass. They're doing what they can in transition. They're not turning the ball over. And then they're 3rd on defense, despite not having a fantastic traditional rim protector. They have other fantastic defensive talent, of course. So for me, those are 2 strong ones. My number 1 is, and I think still was last time, Kenny Atkinson. Atkinson doesn't deserve all of the praise for the Cavs having a 124 clean the glass offensive rating, but he is part
that's
of
an insane number.
It's
by the way. Like what's the highest? Because like we talk about 124 as the number that's like really high when like the best offensive players and the best offenses of all time are on the floor, right? Like Halliburton, the Pacers with Halliburton in the first half of last year was 124. Obviously, Jokic at 126 this year is insane. Like that is just like that's the highest I can ever recall. And like as decent as their talent is overall, like they were viewed as more of a defensive team before this. Like, yes, everybody is shooting the shit out of the ball, but like he obviously has given them a lot of confidence, and just the way that their offense snaps from action to action so quickly, the way he's empowered Evan Mobley, it's really, and also that they still defend as well as they have with playing more offensive players this year. Yeah, Atkinson has to be a clear number one to me.
So Nate, using the basketball reference version of the stats, so it doesn't filter out to garbage time. The 23-24 Boston Celtics are number one, 123.2. 0.2 of a point behind them are this year's Cavs. Then last year's Pacers, this year's Nuggets. So 2 of the top 4 are this year. And then this year's Knicks, so 3 top 5. But remember that a part of the reason why that's the case is because we don't have the full sample. And a lot of times for teams that are this good, the end part of the sample is actually worse because of various different factors. Like maybe they're not competing for seeds, maybe they're doing something else. So like, and we're in an offensive environment, like a lot of the strongest ones in recent seasons. I think Jared Dubin and a couple of people have worked on like a version of like offensive rating plus, which is basically like calibrating it to the league average. I would be interested in where this team, but the Cavs they're a preposterous offense, and they do have a lot of great shooters who are hitting all of their shots this year. But he's done a really good job managing the rotations, and the Cavs they're also, I mean, I brought this up to praise Taylor Jenkins, but Cleveland being 7th on defense, they do have phenomenal tentpoles in Allen and Mobley, but they don't have a lot of other great defenders in this rotation. And I think that could end up being an issue for them in the playoffs, but they're 7th on defense, and those bigs are are going to make your regular season defense better. But I mean, they're playing 2 small guards a lot of the time. And when those guys come out, one of the guys who replace them is Ty Jerome, who is even worse defensively, and they've still been able to make it work.
I still went with Mark Daigneault at number 2. He just is always going to be in my top 3 as a regular season coach. And yes, the Thunder have a lot of talent this year, but it hasn't always been available. Like they've managed to be basically one of the best defenses of all time relative to league average, with Chet Holmgren missing most of the year. Hartenstein has had a couple of issues.
I mean, even other Jalen Williams missing a bunch of time. Yeah. They survived that too.
Yeah. So that's been a huge part of it. And yeah, and because it's not, you might say, oh yeah, they're just like so unbelievable forcing turnovers, but he has them having their cake and eating it too. But there's nowhere that says that this Oklahoma City Thunder team is supposed to be one of the best transition teams, or that they should be the best in transition defense either. And they've fixed their rebounding issues now with some of the bigs, but I think the fact that he's been okay with, in some lineups, just giving up rebounds and just killing you everywhere else has been great. And they've shown some schematic versatility. I still have some concerns about him as a big game playoff coach, because I think it has taken him some time to really find the optimal strategy. Like I think he almost is someone who he really loves creating all of these options and ways to play, and I think that's great. He'll even change up their rotations from night to night. Like Shea doesn't necessarily play the same rotation every night. Most superstars aren't like that. He's got Shea doing that, and that's to kind of find the right matchups within the game. All that is good, but I do think it takes him a little while to zero in on the exact right strategy in big games. Like the NBA Cup was another example of that. But I had him number 2. I mean, they've still been awesome. Those have been the 2 best teams in the league. And number 3 between JB Bickerstaff and Taylor Jenkins was very difficult. Again, this is a regular season award. Both those gentlemen have been fantastic. Udoka has got to be right up there too. And, particularly as we talked about, like for them to be this good without even having an all-star. Yeah, they have a lot of depth. They have a great defense, but he's created this offense out of basically transition and offensive rebounds, and that's it. And then Ty Lue certainly has to be in the discussion, and Joe Mazzulla, I just think he's a great coach, so that's a big part of it too. Even if the Celtics haven't been at their absolute best throughout a lot of years, they've had a lot of injury concerns too. So Atkinson, Daignault, Bickerstaff, very apologetic to Taylor Jenkins, though certainly deserving in most years to me of being in the top 3.
I think we have to get to rookie of the year now. This is, of course, a very weak field. It was a weak field to begin with that got weaker with players like Jared McCain not being eligible. And to me, there is a pretty
Can I still vote for McCain? Is that okay?
No. He's been removed from the ballot. The faithless electoral laws are still in place. So to me, there's a pretty clear top 3. Apologies, I guess, to Stephon Castle. And that 3 involves a newcomer. So to me, it is the 2 Grizzlies I referenced earlier, Jaylen Wells and Zach Edey, and I did have them in that order. And then the third guy is Kel'el Ware. And Kel'el Ware moved into the starting lineup, has, he's an imperfect player, but has made the Heat better, has helped their line, has helped some of their stuff make sense. And so for me, those are the top 3. And I ended up going Wells over Edey. Again, not a surprise that the all-in-one metrics don't really like anybody this year because they shouldn't really. But Wells he's been effective individually, albeit in a small offensive role. 59% true shooting for a perimeter player. Like, that's completely respectable. He's hit 38% of his threes. But also, even though I think he's asked to do too much defensively, like, he has been better as a defensive perimeter rookie than most guys are. And so for me, Wells, like, it's not a case that would win him the rookie of the year in most years, but it is, to be a reasonable case this year.
I would say Wells is the one guy I look at who is actually a starting level player on a decent team. Yeah, he does very little on offense, but he still shoots 6.9 threes per 36 and 38% of those. And then, yeah, he's a little undersized against big wings, powerful guys, but he is actually like quite a positive player against smaller guys. Got really good hands, competes. Certainly not something that I saw coming, just given his general profile coming out of Washington State. And, Edey and Donovan Clingan were my 2 and 3. Clingan, I did a feature on him last week in the 15 and 60, if you want to hear more about that. But to me, he at least has been like an unequivocal big time positive as a rim protector. Only 748 minutes and 16.6 minutes per game is not crazy. Ware actually didn't enter the rotation until much later, but has now played more minutes than him. Problem with Ware is his rim protection hasn't been that good statistically. 65% shooting allowed at the rim, and I don't think he's quite made up for it on offense yet. I think Clingan, just because he has that one skill, like, he's been a really like high quality defensive center, and he does enough on the offensive glass that he can get by at least on offense. So I think that's what stands out to me. Castle, obviously, if you had to say who has had the best high level of moments other than McCain this year, it probably would be Castle in terms of who's shown the most flashes. And certainly anyone in Spurs land is like, how is Castle not the obvious rookie of the year? Well, he just is incredibly inefficient, and he really shoots a lot. He's got like 25% usage and 50% true shooting. That's about 7.5 points below the league average. And yeah, he's been a solid perimeter guard. I don't think he's been quite as good as Wells. And then Wells just like can play on a winning team and make shots. Does that mean that I think Wells is a better prospect than Castle? No. If it were close between them, I would give the nod to Castle because I do believe in giving it to the longer term prospect. But like, Castle's just been killing the Spurs on offense. Like, it's so damaging to have 25% of your possessions used, and that's not even getting into his turnover rate either, which is very high. Like, it is so damaging to have 25% of your possessions be taken up at that level of true shooting and some turnovers too. Like, it really, really hurts your offense like that. Like, and that's not even before, and that's without even considering that this is a guard who nobody's guarding. That's the other thing. He's shooting 27% from three. So not only is just the possessions that he's using up killing you, but then all the possessions that he isn't using are really hurting you as well. So he just has been like one of the worst offensive players in basketball. Like he's not one of the worst offensive players. Like, oh, like if you put him in an empty gym, his skill level, but just in terms of like statistically how much he is damaging you. And I don't begrudge them for letting him do that. He's a prospect. Like the future is the future. They want to groom him and see what he can do. But like he just shouldn't have this large of an offensive role. Like it's absolutely destroys your offense to have a player like that.
And the highlights there, I love Castle's energy and some of what he brings in that respect. Like those things count, but all of the missed shots and the times you don't get guarded count too. And there are more of those than there are the good moments. And so,
yeah, and everyone does this with rookies. It's like you see, hey, every 4 games he has 20 points and he's on SportsCenter with a couple of spectacular finishes at the rim. You're like, man, this guy's amazing, but he's not on SportsCenter the other 3 games when he's shooting 1 of 7 from 3.
Right. And so it's always hard for me because I was so low on Castle relative to everyone else. And I think this season has kind of shown both parts of that. But yeah, I think that we can kind of move beyond that. And so I don't want to do.
We didn't talk about Edie at all, though.
We should.
Both have him number 2. We probably should.
Yes, we should. And so Edie, he's playing about 20 minutes a game for the Grizzlies, and has been effective, relatively speaking. Close to the center average, but 62% true shooting for this class is basically like perfection because nobody's efficient in this class. 13 and a half rebounds per 36 is very, very good. That's below Klingon, but above that. And like Edie, I had my concerns about him as a rim protector, but 36% contest percentage. And I believe is it 56% opponent shooting on the shots that he contests? Like, yeah, it's in the like respectable range. It's not in the great range, but if you are a capable defensive player and an intriguing offensive player, that's that puts you above a lot of dudes in this class. He's not hurting his team.
Yeah, he had, I think the last time we looked at it, like a plus 12 net rating. That's now down to 7.4. Still pretty good for any rookie, especially in this utterly miserable class. AJ Mitchell, sadly, probably out of consideration for us at this point. He was someone who had a big time positive net rating. But yeah, Edie, I do wish he were like just totally dominating on offense. I wish the usage were a little bit higher, 17%. The true shooting is basically right out the positional average for centers at 62%. Like I would hope he would be, in that 66, 67% range, but he's taking a few threes. That's kind of whatever, but also he goes to a lot of these hook shots. And I do wish he were a little bit more physical, a little bit more dominating to get to the line a little bit more. Only 3.3 free throw attempts per 36. Yeah, I think I'm going to put Klingon above him. I don't think for what Edie is supposed to be, I just don't think he's been like quite dominating enough offensively because he obviously has limitations and they spot him extremely carefully. That's how he had the 12 net rating earlier in the season, that they just don't put him in matchups that he can't handle defensively. Like there is he's obviously much more mobile than Boban, but like there is that Boban-esque quality to him where it's like if he's in a good matchup, he can be effective, but if he's in a bad one, he's just instantly going to be out of the game.
Where do you want to go from here?
So our last official one, which is probably all we have time for here, is sixth man of the year.
I have a pretty clear number 1 here. It was the same guy that I had the last time we did awards, and that's Peyton Pritchard. Pritchard he doesn't have the case that you and I love the most for sixth man of the year, which is a player who is important on the bench, but then is also good enough to close. I mean, that has happened a couple of times, but broadly speaking, Pritchard, he isn't always in the Celtics best 5, in part because the Celtics have a really strong 5 overall. But Pritchard's, individual numbers.
Certainly good enough to close for a lot of teams.
A lot of teams, absolutely. And so for Pritchard, I mean, his total creation is 30%, which is pretty strong overall. It's, it's not at the like Trae Young levels or anything like that, but he is just taking and making his 3-pointers. He's over 10 per 36, making 41% of those. And so if you like looking at the all-in-one stats, they're clearly pro Pritchard. I mean, he's been really effective. 64% true shooting for his player type is incredibly impressive. And so for like, especially in the absence of anybody with like the Iguodala-esque case, to me, he's number one if we did tiers for this in a tier by himself.
I don't know that I would quite go that far. He has played the most minutes of any of these guys, despite starting 0 games. He's played 1,620 minutes, and his minutes per game is second. Only DeAndre Hunter is higher, but Pritchard has played 58 games to 43 for DeAndre Hunter. Pritchard is certainly a big candidate to me. Malik Beasley has been an absolute monster, though. He really might be Detroit's second best player. Now, he's never going to be a great defensive player, but he's on like a Steph Curry-esque heater. 12.3 three-point attempts per 36, and he's making 42.5 of them and playing 27 minutes a game. Yeah, the overall true shooting isn't as high as Pritchard, and Pritchard's better on defense. Pritchard also can get to the basket a little bit more. Neither of them are great playmakers, but Pritchard does a little bit more in that area, obviously. But I think Beasley is the bigger offensive threat with what he's done for Detroit this year. Naz Reid is not having his best season. I think that's been his defense has not been very good, and he's been part of why they've struggled on the second unit. Also has started some. He's actually started 25 of 58 games now. Not that I'm sorry, excuse me. He started 13 of 58 games, so he's not close to being ineligible. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, more of the kind of case that I like to highlight here of someone who's a role player, but a very good one, and could be starting level with 58% true shooting. Was there anyone else DeAndre Hunter is the other one who
I have him number 2.
Needs to be highlighted.
Yeah, I have Hunter number 2. He's been very effective. Basically, hasn't missed many shots since he's been a Cap, but was a part of the like on the Hawks, he was their second best forward. It was just that he wasn't starting and Risache was, so that makes him a closer in that respect. Taken 8 threes per 36, making 41% of those. And while Hunter isn't the greatest defensive player, he at least brings positional size and is credible on that end. Like he kind of can fulfill a purpose. I think of Hunter as a better defensive player this year than Malik Beasley has been. Neither one of them is that's not what's defining their seasons. So I have Hunter over Beasley, but it is a close call. I have no opposition to having Beasley. I do have opposition to having Beasley above Pritchard, but not to having him over Hunter.
Yeah, I think that's the top 3 pretty obviously. Hunter, Beasley, and Pritchard. Karis LeVert was in this discussion earlier. His efficiency fell off. Also, just hasn't played as many minutes. He's down in the 1,000-minute range. And I think if Hunter had played as many minutes as Pritchard, I think DeAndre Hunter is a better player than Pritchard. Would you agree with me? Most teams, you'd rather have Hunter than Pritchard?
I think so, but the way Pritchard has played this year, I think it's a closer call than I had previously thought.
Yeah. And again, like Pritchard and Beasley, like DeAndre Hunter, yeah, if he weren't 400 minutes behind those two guys, I probably would have him number 1 because he's just more. Obviously Pritchard and Beasley are real players, but they're more guys who probably need to be bench guys because of their size or just in Beasley's case because he's just too unreliable defensively. Whereas Hunter is just a guy, the way he's played this year at least, could slot in and start on basically any team in the league. It's just a question of his durability and how many minutes he can play. A few other guys I just wanted to shout out before I give my final ranking of those 3. Santi Aldama, has been excellent for the Memphis Grizzlies. Just rock solid in every way offensively, shooting the three, can put the ball on the floor, finish around the rim some, and he's been adequate on defense. And Aaron Wiggins, again, just having another really solid year. He's had didn't he hit a 40-point game at one point? Like he is able to generate a lot more shots. He gets better every year. And I actually think Scoot Henderson is having a nice season off the bench. He's someone that might be heard from a little bit more in this category by the end if Portland continues to play out the string reasonably well. But Scoot actually, they've been better when he's been on the floor. His efficiency is up to being pretty close to league average now. I think he's improved on defense. I don't know if he's quite like a low end starter as a point guard yet, but he's probably been that the last 2 months. But that's something to keep an eye on. Scottie Pippen Jr. just not playing as much recently, so sadly I can't continue to push the apple of my eye there. Yeah, I will ultimately go with Pritchard just because I think he's been a little bit better defensively than Beasley. Beasley 2, Hunter 3, mostly just due to the minutes. All right, then. Well, sadly, we couldn't make it to a few of our made-up categories, but Danny, thank you for joining us when you didn't have to, and Dan and I can at least touch on some of the other categories at some point this week, I think. And he and I will be back tomorrow. Also want to remind everyone to watch on NBA League Pass, Kings Mavs, 7:30 Central Time, 5:30 Pacific. Tomorrow, Danny and I will be on to watch that one. We had to change up because the game we were going to do, which was Rockets Grizz or something?
Rockets Thunder.
Rockets Thunder, yeah. Sadly, that one got changed to NBA TV, so we can't do the NBA TV game. So now we're doing Kings Mavs, but that'll actually be a great chance to check out what the Kings are at this point, really lock in on that. So please join us 5:30 Pacific time on the NBA app tomorrow. Talk to you all soon.